If UFC 5 is anything to go by, UFC 6 is going to have a stacked roster, but unfortunately for some fighters, UFC 5 will be their last appearance with the franchise. In this video, we are breaking down over 30 fighters in UFC 5 who potentially will not be on the UFC 6 roster. Some might catch you by surprise. Appreciate you joining me. Before we begin, please drop a like and subscribe. Thank you. Starting off in the flyweight division, the first fighter on the chopping block is Joseph Benavidez. He's a former multi-time title challenger and one of the most important flyweights early on in the division. Benavidez last fought in 2021 and officially retired soon after. Since then, he's become a professional pickleball player. He's unlikely to have a base roster fighter in UFC 6, however he is a strong candidate for an alter ego or legacy version down the line. Jussier Formiga, one of the quiet stalwarts of the early UFC flyweight division. He hasn't competed in the UFC since 2020. He competed for the LFA. Now he's putting most of his focus into BJJ competition. His resume's aged extremely well. Wins over Davison Figueiredo and Sergio Pettis back when they were still rising prospects. Given his long absence and career shift, he's unlikely to make the UFC 6 roster. Moving up to bantamweight, we have John Dodson. He was a two-time title challenger at flyweight. Dodson hasn't competed in the UFC since 2020. Since leaving the promotion, he's fought in Ryzen and become a regular bare-knuckle competitor. His wins over TJ Dillashaw and Tim Elliott still hold up, but with his career now firmly outside the UFC, his chances of appearing in UFC 6 is slim. Thomas Almeida. This guy was once viewed as a future contender. Almeida's UFC run ended with a KO loss to Sugar Sean O'Malley back in 2021. Since then, he's shifted towards grappling matches and the occasional regional MMA appearance. Given the length of time since his last UFC fight, he's an easy omission candidate. Rafael Assunção retired in March 2023. He had a really good pro record. He's now running his own business and coaching martial arts, unlikely to be in UFC 6. Jimmy Rivera, a former top 10 bantamweight who consistently fought the division's elite. Rivera hasn't competed in the UFC since 2021 and has since moved into bare-knuckle boxing. Despite his strong resume, his post-UFC career path makes him an unlikely inclusion to UFC 6. Magic Marlon Moraes. Oh, man. A former title challenger whose decline was as fast as his rise, and his rise was really sick to watch. KO win over Aljo. He last competed in the UFC in 2022, has since transitioned into grappling competitions, and now fights with the PFL. His recent non-UFC activity makes him another likely exclusion. We're in the featherweight division now. Markwan Amirkhani, Mr. Finland, was always gritty and entertaining. He lost his last UFC fight in 2023 and has returned to the regional MMA competition. He's still active, but his absence from the UFC roster likely keeps him out of UFC 6. Mirsad Bektic, once considered a future contender, Bektic last competed in the UFC in 2020, officially retired in 2021. He now works in coaching and nutrition, staying connected to the sport without competing. A long shot inclusion to UFC 6 at best. Alex Caceres. Bruce Leroy, he's a wild card to be included in UFC 6. Caceres has reinvented himself multiple times. He's still active. Last competed in bare knuckle. He's remained relevant for longer than many names on this list. I'm hoping EA keeps Bruce Leroy in the game because he's still very much a part of the modern era and he's got that backyard alter ego, so I hope they keep Alex Caceres. Charles Rosa. Rosa last competed in the UFC in 2022 and has since continued fighting on the regional scene. While still active, his lack of recent UFC appearances likely works against him when it comes to being in UFC 6. We're in the lightweight division now. Raging Ally Quinta, a fan favourite and former interim title challenger. Iaquinta last fought in 2021. He's now retired from MMA and works full-time as a real estate agent. Given his retirement and time away, he's almost certainly out. Yancy Medeiros, the Hawaiian, known for his wild fights and durability. Medeiros last competed in the UFC in 2021 before signing to Bellator. His move to another major promotion makes him a likely exclusion. Oh man, Kevin Lee. This is one of the most interesting cases. Lee left the UFC in 2021, returned briefly for one fight in 2023, is now competing under the PFL banner. Despite his name value, his inconsistent UFC presence makes him a fringe pick at best. Alex Oliveira. Cowboy Oliveira last fought in the UFC in 2022, is fighting on the regional circuit. He's still active, but he's well removed from the UFC landscape, so is very unlikely to be in UFC 6. Mark Diakase. Diakase is a fun fighter to use in the game. He last competed for the UFC in 2023, has since signed with Bellator. He's a flashy striker, name recognition, but another fighter whose move outside the UFC hurts his chances of being in UFC 6. Rustam Khabilov. Now, it's almost crazy this guy's in UFC 5. He last fought for the UFC in 2019. He's now focused on coaching. He's worked with Muhammad Makayev. His long absence makes his inclusion to UFC 6 almost impossible. Moving up to the welterweight division, Tom Breeze, a talented but inconsistent fighter whose UFC career was derailed by inactivity and personal struggles. Breeze hasn't competed in the UFC for years and is effectively out of the picture. Mickey Gall. Gall last competed in 2024 and is currently on a 4-fight losing streak. While his recent activity gives him a slim chance, he feels like a borderline roster decision to be included in UFC 6. Alan Jouban. Jouban hasn't fought in the UFC since 2019 and has since transitioned into media work and analysis. Given the time gap, he's very unlikely to appear. It's crazy he's even in UFC 5. Platinum Mike Perry. One of the clearest omissions. Perry hasn't fought in the UFC since 2021 and is now a co-owner and active fighter in BKFC, where he's become arguably the promotion's biggest star. With his complete separation from the UFC, he's almost certainly out. Damian Maia, one of the greatest grapplers in UFC history. Maia last competed in 2021 and retired shortly after. While his legacy is undeniable, he's far more likely to be remembered in an alter ego or legend spot rather than a base inclusion. In the middleweight division, we have Omari Akhmedov, a consistent tough out during his UFC run. Akhmedov hasn't fought in the UFC since 2021 and now competes on the regional scene, another likely cut. Smilin' Sam Alvey. Alvey's UFC run ended in 2022 after an infamous 8-fight winless streak. Since then, he's found success in karate combat. He became the heavyweight champion. Despite his post-UFC resurgence, his late career UFC record hurts his chances. Oh man, Uriah Primetime Hall, a former Ultimate Fighter finalist with a highlight reel knockout on the show. Hall last fought for the UFC in 2022 and has since transitioned into karate combat. A big name, but probably absent from UFC 6. Derek Brunson, a longtime contender and gatekeeper in the middleweight division. Brunson last fought in 2023 and appears to be retired. Given his age and inactivity, he's very unlikely to make the cut. Krzysztof Jotko, a durable middleweight who stuck around quietly for years. Jotko hasn't competed in the UFC recently and has largely fallen off the radar, making his inclusion doubtful. Misha Serkinov. Serkinov hasn't competed since 2022 and is widely presumed retired. With no recent activity, he's almost certainly out. This guy right here, Gökhan Saki, Turkish Tyson, please brother, we don't talk about him being cut from UFC 6. Moving up to the heavyweight division, Alexei Olenek, a submission legend. Olenek last fought in the UFC in 2022. Given his age and recent departure from the promotion, he's likely to be excluded. Alexander Romanov. Romanov's situation is more recent, but with roster changes and uncertainty around his UFC future, he's a possible omission depending on the final cutoff. Stefan Struve, the tallest fighter in UFC history. He retired after his last appearance in 2020, a memorable career, but firmly in the past, unlikely to be in UFC 6. And the final fighter on this list, Jairzinho Rozenstruik. Biggie boy, his might be an exception. Rozenstruik last competed in 2025, earlier this year, and even captured the Dirty Boxing Heavyweight Championship. He's still active at a high level, and despite some uncertainty, he could still be in UFC 6, but he's on the chopping block also. I think this is a comprehensive list of fighters at risk of being cut. It's not as impactful as losing fighters like Brock, Francis, and Yoel from UFC 4, but it's looking like the number of cuts heading into UFC 6 will be much larger. I've left off legends, former champions, and alter egos, as they will likely always have a spot in future games, but if I've missed anyone you think will be cut or disagree, drop a like and subscribe and let me know. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.